In January 1944, the skies of Europe were still scarred by the fierce fighting of the previous years. But in the midst of this all-out war, a decision was made that would change the fate of the continent's air force in a matter of weeks. When James "Jimmy" Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, generations of bomber commanders and crews knew that dangerous days lay ahead. Doolittle was a man who was not afraid of taking risks. He had led the daring attack on Japan years earlier. Now, he wanted to end the air race once and for all. Before that, the bitter experience of Black Thursday, the second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, was still fresh in everyone's mind. Hundreds of heavy bombers took off from England to target German bearing factories, and many never returned home. Short-range escort fighters were unable to defend against the successive waves of German fighters. Casualties were heavy, and morale was low. That experience showed that continuing with the same tactics would cost many lives. The real revolution began when the P-51 Mustang flew alongside the bombers. The P-51 is itself a tale of engineering and evolution. An aircraft designed to meet the needs of the time, powered by the Rolls-Royce/Pagard Merlin engine, and dramatically improved its range and high-altitude performance. When the Mustang was combined with additional fuel tanks and the Merlin engine, it was now a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers into the heart of Germany. This technical change made possible a tactic that had previously been unthinkable: going beyond the borders and escorting deep into enemy territory. The Big Week Operation Argument, which took place from February 20th to 25th, 1944, saw the decision to engage the Luftwaffe in full-scale combat. The goal was not simply to destroy enemy industrial facilities. This time, the goal was a direct, attritional struggle against the enemy's air force, from its pilots to its factories and production resources. Such a plan required meticulous coordination, courage on the part of the pilots, and the acceptance of great risks. Many bomber crews initially did not welcome it. Fighter escort meant flying closer and longer to targets, and facing greater resistance from enemy air defenses. The first days of Big Week began with planned attacks on engine factories, airframes, and air bases. The bombers took off, escorted by P-51s. In the sky, a spectacular but terrifying scene emerged. Columns of bombers at high altitudes, the silver wings of Mustangs dancing around them. A contrast between the heavy bombing tactics and the deceptive maneuverability of the fighters. When the German fighters took off from their bases, they no longer faced defenseless bombers. They saw an order they had never seen before. Bombers, fighter escorts, and then the supporting fighters, seeking to break through the defenses. In this series of attacks, American pilots scored victories and defeats that marked the history of the war. Chuck Yeager, a young man from West Virginia, flew his P-51 Glamorous Glenn and learned in the skies of Europe how to fight the enemy to the death. Don Gentile and Don Blakesley were famous commanders and pilots who dealt deadly blows to the Luftwaffe with their bold and aggressive tactics. Men who not only sought to hunt down planes, but also practically tried to destroy the enemy's air defense infrastructure and self-confidence. The fighting intensified over Berlin, Hamburg, and other industrial centers. In one mission, a wave of P-51s rushed into the skies over Berlin. Each air engagement was a combination of decisive speed and deadly precision. American pilots targeted the Luftwaffe's airways, concentrating on destroying fuel depots, airfields, and ready-to-fly aircraft. One after another, German pilots who had previously felt in control saw their comrades fall and their perceived superiority erode. Over the 6 days of Big Week, the number of sorties, operational flights, reached thousands, and casualties on both sides were considerable. Bombers and their escorts paid a heavy price, but the blow to the Luftwaffe went beyond the number of aircraft. Large numbers of experienced pilots and distinguished commanders were lost or damaged, and German training and production facilities were exposed. Germany could no longer quickly replace lost manpower and aircraft. Its industrial and educational systems gradually became exhausted. A field scene from one of the days captures the mood of the era well. The cold air, the smoke of fuel, bits of metal in the sky, and radios broadcasting the ominous message of encounter with the enemy. At the same time, another message was being sent to the Allied forces. The skies could now be used to the advantage of ground operations. The Big Week was not simply a show of air power, but a strategic shift that allowed the Allies to plan the next phase, the major landings in Normandy, with greater hope of success. Before this success, the Allied armies had been beset by two major technical and logistical problems. First, the lack of long-range escort aircraft, and second, the need for tactics to counter the swarms of German fighters. Similar to what had happened at Schweinfurt, bomber crews had suffered from fighters leaving the border before reaching their targets. Now, with the P-51, and with the planning of Doolittle and the air commanders, this deficiency was virtually eliminated. Behind the scenes of this success was a process of trial and error, technical innovation, and logistical coordination. Engineers worked to increase the P-51's range and endurance. Internal and external fuel tanks were added. Aerodynamic improvements were made, and the Pagard Merlin engine ensured high-altitude performance. Pilot training also became more intensive and realistic. Group exercises, training in new tactics, and a focus on close cooperation between bombers and fighters paid off. The technical statistics should not be overlooked. American fighters managed to destroy a significant number of German aircraft and bases during Big Week, although they themselves suffered losses. The ratio of hits to enemy capital was clearly in favor of the Allies. This destructive power acquired strategic significance over time. German factories and production lines were no longer able to quickly compensate for losses. The Allied artillery of the sky, a combination of heavy bombers and escort fighters, reached tactical maturity during this period. New tactics included direct penetration of bases, simultaneous attacks on engine and aircraft production facilities, and planned engagements to eliminate experienced enemy pilots. The loss of these pilots was far more dangerous than the loss of an aircraft, since replacing a trained pilot was time-consuming and resource-intensive. The psychological failure of the Luftwaffe was becoming increasingly apparent. German pilots, who had previously taken to the skies with confidence, were now faced with anxiety and a lack of comrades. The constant psychological pressure, combined with the material damage to production lines, weakened the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities. For the Allies, it was the beginning of a short but decisive period that would lead to air superiority off the beaches of Normandy. The individual stories of the pilots are also very impressive. Chuck Yeager, who would later become an aviation legend and a test pilot of supersonic speed, was a daring young man who endured the difficult experiences of the March air battles and the ensuing battles. Don Gentile and Don Blakeslade led groups that managed to put the enemy on the defensive by using such tactics as irregular attacks on bases and reconnaissance of supply lines. These pilots not only targeted enemy aircraft, but also the morale and leadership of the Luftwaffe. The consequences of Big Week went beyond the number of casualties. With a significant loss of experienced pilots and aircraft, the Germans had to make up for the time lost. The production lines tried, of course, but the coordinated bombing and successive attacks took time. By the time the Normandy campaign began in June 1944, the skies of Europe were under complete Allied control. This control effectively allowed ground forces to maneuver and attack on a scale that would not have been possible without it.
Big Week can be seen as a turning point that showed how the right combination of technology, training, and calculated risk could quickly take an army from a defensive position to an offensive and dominant position. Whereas before, air warfare had been largely a matter of localized, reactive engagements, the focus of Allied command was now on systematic, targeted attacks. Strikes not only on aircraft, but also on the heart of the enemy's productive and training capacity. Historical memory has recorded the names of Doolittle, Yeager, Gentile, Blakesley, and hundreds of other unknown pilots. Names that show how a commander's decision, the implementation of technical innovation, and individual courage can change the equation. For every pilot who returned, several families mourned. The cost of this development was sometimes very high, but its strategic outcome was undoubtedly decisive. Big Week also taught lessons about logistical and industrial planning, the importance of having continuous and resilient production, the necessity of ensuring pilot training, and the need for flexibility in tactics. The Germans, who had dominated the skies of Europe for years, now faced a shortage of human and industrial resources, a problem that would show itself on the field in the months that followed. Historically, Big Week is recognized as one of the most decisive air operations of World War II. It changed the course of the war in Europe not only tactically, but also strategically, paving the way for subsequent Allied successes, including the Normandy landings. This event shows how the combination of new technology, the P-51 and Merlin engines, leadership innovation, Doolittle and other commanders, and the courage of young pilots was able to break down the mighty wall of the Luftwaffe. Years after the war ended, historians and military analysts have analyzed the Great Week again and again to understand its full scope. Each time they return to the documents, new details of how the flights, mistakes, and successes were coordinated emerge. But one truth remains constant. The Great Week was a show of engineering and human willpower. A show that even at the height of the enemy's power, victory could be achieved with the right combination of elements. Finally, when the waves of bombs and smoke subsided, and the skies of Europe became calm again, the result of that week was recorded in the pages of history. A severe weakening of the German Air Force, a boost in Allied confidence, and the preparation for successful ground attacks. And what remains most memorable of all is the image of fighters, wings gleaming and engines roaring, passing the columns of bombers, a symbol of a game-changing event that changed the world forever.